This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. If you're listening in real time, new groups are forming in April of 2018. Reserve your spot today by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 185. Welcome to the 185th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I recently created a free 3-part video series all about the fertility awareness method and how you can utilize the fertility awareness method to develop body literacy. So to really connect you with your cycles and really understand what's happening in your body. And so if you haven't had a chance to get your copy of my free video series, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to gain access to my 3-part video series all about fertility awareness charting. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. I'm excited to share today's episode with you. In today's episode, I wanted to address one of the questions that is so common. I get it all the time. It's something that I regularly talk about with clients. It's something that always comes up in my group programs. And it's also a question that comes up quite a bit in my Facebook community. And so in today's episode, we're going to be talking about progesterone, how to know if your progesterone is potentially low by charting, how it would appear and on your chart, what it would look like in your menstrual cycle, and what to do about it. So that's what we'll be talking about in today's episode. Now, whether you've been charting for a while or whether you're brand new to charting, there's different stages that I found that my clients will go through. So typically the very first stage when you're brand new to charting is when you're just learning how to chart. You're learning how to put all the different signs together, learning how to figure out your cervical mucus, how to observe it, how to chart it, learning how to interpret your basal body temperature and also your cervical position, and kind of putting it together with any other signs and symptoms that you notice throughout your menstrual cycle. And so at the very beginning of the journey, it's often the nitty-gritty that is most challenging. So it's kind of like learning to drive. You really got to figure out how all the signs work and all of the basic things that just allow you to get from point A to point B. But once you get a handle on the charting aspect of it, there's a second phase, and especially if your charts are not lining up, they don't look exactly how they do in the textbook, or if you realize that your charts are falling outside of normal parameters, that's kind of the second phase where you may find that you need a little bit of support sorting it all out. So wherever you are on your journey, I have a number of programs to support you through that process. And so I've been supporting women to not only to learn how to chart, but also to figure out how to recognize that how to really recognize and identify what your chart is telling you about your overall health. And so I've been doing that for a long time. And so make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/work with me for more information about the programs that I offer. And if you're not sure which program would be the best fit, make sure to set up a complimentary 15-minute consultation with me. We can actually go through which program would work better for you. So with that said, let's jump into today's episode. In today's episode, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about progesterone. And so I'm going to take you through basically just what is low progesterone, what's the significance of that, how does it show up in the chart, what is the comparison between a normal chart and a chart that you would see if you did have low progesterone, and of course, what to do about it. So what are the steps that you would take to rectify it? And so let's just start at the very, very beginning. What does low progesterone look like on the chart, and how would you know if your progesterone is low? So one of the things that I always talk about is that often we kind of hang on to these buzzwords. So we think low progesterone as though it's something that would happen in isolation. So I think that in order to get a sense of what that really means, you have to think about the menstrual cycle as a whole. And so progesterone is what you produce after ovulation. And progesterone is produced inside of your ovaries. It's produced by your ovaries by a gland called the corpus luteum. And what's interesting is that you're producing estrogen in the pre-ovulatory phase. So when you have your period at the very beginning of your cycle, after your period finishes, that's when your ovaries start producing estrogen at the start of your cycle. Once you ovulate, your corpus luteum forms out of the follicle that actually released the egg. So one thing to keep in mind is that there is a relationship between estrogen and progesterone because they're both produced essentially from the same place. They're both produced inside of your ovary. And so it's possible that if you have challenges with progesterone production, you may also be having challenges with estrogen production. But back to the question, what is low progesterone? How do you know if your progesterone is low? And so from the charting perspective, like how it would show up in the chart, there are a number of signs that indicate that your progesterone may be low when you're taking a look at the chart. So I think the classic signs of low progesterone show up as a short luteal phase. So that's the first thing. And often it'll show up with premenstrual spotting. So before your period actually starts, you may find that you have several days where you're actually noticing some bleeding, whether it's just a little bit, like you wipe yourself and you just notice a little bit, or whether it's a little bit more, but it's not your period. It's clearly spotting. And so for those of you who may be new to the podcast or you're not as familiar with the menstrual cycle, when I use the word luteal phase, that's just a word that refers to the period of time between when you ovulate and when your next period comes. So it's essentially the second half of your menstrual cycle. And so what's interesting about the menstrual cycle is that the menstrual cycle is variable. So of course, the big myth is that the cycle is always 28 days, it's always the same, and that you always ovulate on day 14. So I've seen enough charts from enough women to know that that's not a real thing. And the menstrual cycle length is definitely variable. But what's interesting about the menstrual cycle is that the period of your cycle that varies is the pre-ovulatory phase. And so if you're paying attention to your cycles and you notice that there's some cycle variation, so maybe one cycle you have a 29-day cycle, the following cycle it's 31 days, and then maybe the cycle after that is 32 days. So if you were to take a look and kind of deconstruct your cycle, if you were charting, what you would find is that the date of ovulation is what's actually shifting. So maybe sometimes your ovulation is happening a little bit earlier, and other times your ovulation is happening a little bit later in the cycle. But when you pay attention to the cycle, what you'll find as well is that the luteal phase tends to stay quite stable. So what women find when they chart their cycle for quite a while is that although they can't predict when their ovulation is going to happen, because ovulation will not happen on the exact same day every single cycle, they are able to predict their periods because their luteal phase is relatively stable. So an average length for the luteal phase falls between about 12 to 14 days. And the absolute range of the luteal phase, healthy luteal phase, is an absolute minimum of about 10 days. And 10 days is on the short side, all the way up to about 16 days. And so there are times when the luteal phase can extend a little bit beyond that. So for those of you who are familiar with charting, and for those of you who've read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, you'll know that if you ovulate and if your luteal phase extends past 18 days, that's typically a positive pregnancy test. So 18 high temperatures, so basically 18 days past ovulation, if you have not yet got your period, that is a sign that you should probably take a pregnancy test. There are certain situations, if you have an issue with ovulation, for instance, there's a condition called luteinized unruptured follicle, where maybe the egg doesn't fully ovulate properly. And so you may actually have a luteal phase that extends 16, 17, 18 days, and you're not pregnant, but that's more of a rare situation. So what does this have to do with progesterone? Well, in order to, the question of how low progesterone might show up on the menstrual cycle chart, what that might look like, if you have a sense that a healthy luteal phase falls somewhere between about 10 to 16 days, and the average falls between about 12 to 14 days, then if you find that your luteal phase is consistently 10 days or lower, so you have a luteal phase that's maybe 9 days or 8 days, then you know that it's on the low side and your progesterone is likely on the low side as well. So the other thing that I mentioned is spotting before your period. And so although, again, it is very common, especially for women who are coming off of hormonal contraceptives, it's not what we would consider to be optimal or ideal in the menstrual cycle. And so progesterone has a number of different roles in the body. So one of the important roles of progesterone, which is related to your period, is that progesterone is responsible for helping the uterine lining to mature in preparation for pregnancy. So estrogen and progesterone have different roles in preparing the uterine lining. And so it's progesterone's job to really help the lining to mature. And when your progesterone levels are sufficient, progesterone kind of holds up your lining and keeps it in place. So when you see that you have spotting that's happening before your period, it typically is indicating to us that your progesterone levels are not high enough to keep it in place. So that is, why low progesterone will show up in that way. So meaning that either your period is coming sooner, like your luteal phase is shorter, because again, the progesterone level isn't high enough to keep the lining in place. So then you start bleeding sooner. Or even if your period starts at the right, quote unquote, right time, and your luteal phase is long enough, you're still seeing several days of spotting. The bleeding is kind of starting to break, like your lining is kind of starting to break down. And so both of those are indications that your progesterone could be on the low side. So there's a number of other ways that this may show up on your chart. And so what's interesting, so for those of you who have been charting your cycles already, or for those of you who might be new to charting, one of the main fertile signs that we're paying attention to is basal body temperature. Now, basal body temperature, you're taking your temperature first thing in the morning before you get out of bed, and that's giving us a sense of your resting body metabolism. And so there's a direct link between your resting metabolism and your progesterone levels. So the reason that our temperature actually changes after ovulation is because of progesterone. So progesterone causes our body temperature, our resting metabolism, to actually rise a little bit. And that's why we can actually take our temperature and use that to confirm whether or not we've ovulated. So what that means is that you can actually pay attention to your temperatures and see where they're at, see how they fall, see what that arc looks like. So in a healthy cycle with sufficient progesterone levels, we would expect to see an arc where your temperature after ovulation shifts, so it rises, and it rises fairly significantly and stays high. So it'd be kind of, I'm drawing a circle with my hand that you clearly can't see because this is a podcast, but you would see it's like a little mountain. And so if you were plotting your temperatures each day on the graph, you should see an arc, like kind of like a rainbow or a mountain, like meaning that it goes higher. And then eventually, as you approach the end of your luteal phase, as you approach the end of your cycle, then it would gradually decline. So, I've seen a lot of charts where women have signs of low progesterone, and sometimes you'll see there's no real arc, like the temperature doesn't really rise that much, or the temperature does rise and then it sharply drops, and it drops several days before either the period comes or several days before essentially it's supposed to. And often that drop in temperature coincides with the spotting. So you can think of your temperature in many ways as a reflection of your progesterone levels when we're looking at your post-ovulatory phase. And one last sign when you're paying attention to your menstrual cycle. So this would typically happen kind of along with some of these other signs. So one of the things that's interesting about paying attention to the menstrual cycle is that nothing really happens in isolation. It's all related to each other. But if you think about what I mentioned earlier about the role of progesterone in helping the uterine lining to mature, sometimes if your progesterone is low, you may notice some of these other signs, but you may also notice that your period is either really light or possibly dark in color, kind of like molasses, like kind of, it just doesn't look as like bright and red and kind of juicy as you would expect it to look like. So, by itself, I don't know that that would necessarily be conclusive. I know for all the years I've been doing this, I can't like look at one sign and make a rash judgment, but really what we're looking at is the whole situation, kind of putting the pieces together. So basically what that means is that the quality of your period can also illustrate to us to some degree your progesterone level. And that's just because when you consider the role of progesterone in actually building and maturing that uterine lining. And so, of course, one of the things that I wanted to address is a normal luteal phase. So I've already alluded to that a little bit. So you would expect the luteal phase to be on average about 12 to 14 days long with an absolute minimum of about 10 days. So 10 to 16 days or so, we would expect the luteal phase to kind of fall somewhere in there. We would expect, like I mentioned, the temperature to actually rise and have a good arc. So actually rising and staying high. And we would, if you don't conceive in that cycle, so if you're not pregnant, we would expect your temperature to fall, but typically it's falling either the day that you have your period or the day before. In a healthy kind of normal luteal phase, we would also expect to see no premenstrual spotting. And so that kind of gives you that reference between like a normal cycle where the progesterone levels are where they're supposed to be and a cycle where we're having potentially low progesterone. So one of the interesting things is, one of the things I talk about on the show a lot, especially for those of you who've listened to the show for a while, is that when you're looking, you can actually use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool. So it doesn't mean you can look at the cycle and say, this is definitely what's happening. But when you see signs like this, it can actually help you to give you that first clue that, you know what, I think this is what's going on. So this brings us to the next point. So now that we've talked about what low progesterone looks like on the chart, it's important for us to talk about what it means and why we might be seeing it. So one of the misconceptions that I've seen a lot is the idea that it's kind of happening on its own and there's some sort of magical supplement or something that's going to fix it. So the idea is, well, if the progesterone's low, like what do I take to make it go back to normal? And so I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the reasons why you may have these signs of low progesterone in your chart. And I really want to kind of get at the idea that there's not necessarily just one reason why this could be happening. There are a lot of different factors at play that can contribute to this. So the first thing that I want to talk about, the context of it. One of the first things that I would want to know, so if I was talking to somebody and they were telling me that they have signs of low progesterone, they're noticing premenstrual spotting, they're worried that their temperatures aren't high enough in the post-ovulatory phase, or they have a really short luteal phase and they're concerned about that, the first thing I'd want to know is their birth control history. And so, what the research tells us is that it takes several months after you've come off of hormonal contraceptives before your cycles will normalize. And one of the specific factors that we see post-pill is actually a short luteal phase. And so that's not the only thing that we see, but I think it's really helpful and important to know that statistically speaking, if you've recently come off of hormonal contraceptives, you're more likely to have short luteal phases and signs of low progesterone for the first several charts. And so one of the studies that I've referred to on the show before, it was a very interesting study because it took a group of women who had never been on any type of hormonal contraceptives and compared them to women who had taken hormonal contraceptives long term. In this particular study, they actually looked at the different phases of the menstrual cycle and kind of quantified it to see what was the pre-ovulatory phase like, what was the post-ovulatory luteal phase like. And what they found was that it took between 9 to 12 cycles before the contraceptive group looked like the never users group. So what this means is that it takes several months. If you've recently come off of hormonal birth control, it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do to support your body to really get through that transition phase, increase your hormone production. But what it means is that we have to take into consideration the context. And so if that's you, if you've recently come off of hormonal birth control and you have short luteal phases, we have to kind of first know that is likely the reason. And it's normal for this to take a few months before it sorts itself out. So I think it's also helpful to know that there are a couple other situational instances of a short luteal phase. And so I might not be listing every single possibility here, but if you've recently had a baby and you've been breastfeeding for a while, when your cycle first comes back, so when you first start ovulating again and you get your first period postpartum, it is also common for those first couple of periods to be a little bit off, or those first couple cycles. So it is common then for the first couple cycles, potentially for your luteal phase, to be a little bit shorter as your body normalizes, since you've had several months without cycling. It's not the same as post-pill. It may not take as long for your body to normalize postpartum. Of course, it doesn't mean that you can't conceive, but it's just something, especially if you're charting and you're paying attention and you notice that your luteal phase is a little bit short and you've just had a baby and you've been breastfeeding and these are the first couple of cycles that you've had postpartum. It's helpful to know that it's common so that you're not, freaking out thinking, oh my goodness, there's something wrong with me, when really it can just take a couple of cycles to normalize. Another instance of this would be post-miscarriage or post-abortion. So it is possible in those situations as well that the first cycle back might be a little bit wonky. You may notice that your luteal phase is a little bit shorter. So those are kind of situational examples of how the situation that preceded it can have an effect on the luteal phase. Moving away from kind of those specific situations, in general, I've also seen signs of low progesterone and short luteal phases in clients at times of stress. And so it's one of those situations where it's often in retrospect that we look back at the chart, and someone like me asking all the questions, being the interviewer that I am, but someone like me kind of looking at the chart and saying like, well, was anything going on around that time? Did you change anything? Was anything different this cycle? So stress can mean anything from the typical, like your boss yelling at you or, traffic or whatever is the case. But it can also mean travel. It can also mean a change in your exercise routine. So that's something that's come up with clients recently, as well as in my Facebook community. So I've had a number of clients who've switched up their exercise routine, or they've been going real hard, going to the gym every day, and they'll notice that their luteal phase is a bit shorter, or all of a sudden they start spotting in their luteal phase. And so I think it's helpful to keep in mind a few things. So stress, we're all kind of familiar with the stress hormone cortisol. And what's important to know is that your body makes cortisol from progesterone. Literally. So if you look at a diagram of how steroid hormones are made and how they're synthesized, you start with cholesterol, and then all of the different steroid hormones are then made from cholesterol. And so the step before cortisol is progesterone. So what that means is that if you have a significant stressor in your post-ovulatory phase, then it is one of the signs, one of the ways that could show up on your chart, one of the ways that can affect your menstrual cycle. In that stressful situation, it's literally stealing from your progesterone to make cortisol so that you can deal with it and handle it. And so that can show up as either a short luteal phase or premenstrual spotting. So in addition to those factors, there's a lot of other factors that can contribute or be related to a short luteal phase. So outside of those situational issues, thyroid issues can contribute to low hormones in general, including progesterone. So it's not uncommon if you have a thyroid issue that is not being addressed, it's not uncommon for that to impact your hormones, and for you to actually see signs of low progesterone as a result of that. And also if there's some sort of chronic stressor that you're dealing with. So if you have some sort of gut issues or food sensitivities or something like that, something that's really stressing your body, if your body's fighting something off, if you're really sick or something like that, and or just something kind of underlying. But we often think of stress as the boss yelling at you, or the fight with the coworker or whatever. And we don't often think of stress as like the chronic gut issue or an underlying infection or something like that. And so those types of situations can also increase your cortisol levels and therefore negatively impact your progesterone. Part of the reason that I go through all of these different factors is because often what I see in online forums and the types of discussions that take place is like, oh, if you have low progesterone, just take this thing, or take this supplement, take this herb. And although those things can be helpful, if you have an underlying issue, So for instance, like if you have a thyroid issue that's unaddressed, some of those supplements may not be helpful because they may not be addressing the actual root cause of the issue. And so it's really important to take a look at your chart and your situation, your life, and look at all the factors that could be contributing to this issue in your chart. That's what I think is one of the most important takeaways. So, of course, this brings us to what to do about it. What can we actually do? So if you are listening to this episode because you do have a short luteal phase and you are seeing premenstrual spotting and you are wanting to know what you can do to support your body and to support your hormone production, I'm going to go through a few things that can be helpful. So these are a lot of non-invasive steps that you can take that can really make a huge difference in your progesterone production. And it may not be what you think or thought I was going to say, but I found that this is a really great and important place to start before you jump into magical supplements and things like that. So, the very first thing that I would want to look at is sleep. So although it may not seem like this is where we should start, it is extremely important. And not just sleep and how much you're sleeping, but also the quality of the sleep that you're getting and the environment that you're in. So again, when we're thinking about progesterone, when we're thinking about hormone production, and especially in the back of our minds, now that we know how stress and cortisol can literally steal your progesterone, we really want to look at the factors that could have a negative impact on the hormones or that could kind of throw your hormones out of balance. And so one of the things that you can do to improve your hormone production, especially in the luteal phase, is make sure that you are getting enough sleep, but also that you're sleeping in the dark. That's a really big one. There's a lot of research that supports the notion that when you are not sleeping in the dark, so if your bedroom is not actually pitch black, like it's not dark, and there's light coming in, you're exposed to the light, whether it's street lights outside or whether it's LED lights on your radio, however the lights are coming in, those lights actually stimulate the photoreceptors on your skin and they interfere with your normal hormone production. And so when you're exposed to light at nighttime, it actually stimulates cortisol production. So if any of you have ever had that experience where you start to feel a little bit tired and then you turn on the TV and you don't feel tired anymore, well, what's interesting is that in the research, it shows that light has a similar effect to coffee. If you expose yourself to light late at night, it actually has a similar effect to coffee in terms of how it affects your cortisol levels, your melatonin levels, and then consequently your progesterone levels. Many women have found that by simply changing their sleep environment, getting some blackout blinds, it doesn't have to be fancy, like throwing a blanket over the window, but figuring out a way to make your room dark. Not only do you sleep better, because if your room is dark, you actually have a more sound sleep, but many women find that just that alone, that simple change, can lengthen their luteal phase, get rid of premenstrual spotting, and even normalize their cycles so that they're maybe not ovulating as late in their cycle. So I'm not promising anything here, but this is something that definitely can make a significant impact in your cycle, more so than you would think. Like, you wouldn't really think that just sleeping in the dark would make that big of a difference in your cycle, but especially if you're listening and you know that your room is like not dark at all, it could really make a difference for you. So I would say start there. And especially if this concept is new to you, there are a couple episodes that I will suggest that you go back and listen to. Episode number 53 is an episode that I've recorded with Joy DeFelice a couple years ago. What's interesting is Joy DeFelice actually conducted research on women and wrote a book about the effect of light on the menstrual cycle. And so that is an extremely interesting episode, especially if this concept of light and how it affects the menstrual cycle, if that intrigues you, you'll want to listen to that episode. And also in episode 68, I had an interview with Sean Stevenson of the Model Health Show, and he talked about sleep. The whole episode, we talked about sleep, and we talked about the importance of sleeping in the dark, but he also talks about how to optimize your sleep, especially if you have trouble sleeping or if you have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. That is a great episode to listen to just to really get at what you can do to optimize your sleep. So moving on from sleep, another thing that I would encourage you to pay attention to, especially when you're thinking about how to support your progesterone production, is stress. So that's kind of a broad topic, but especially if it's a situational thing, if you notice that there are times when your cycle, like your luteal phase, is shorter, or times when you've had spotting and you're not really sure why, just take a look at stress as kind of a broad topic. Like, look at your exercise routine, look at your relationships, look at your work, just look at all the different areas of your life and see if there's anything that you can do to reduce stress, whether that is developing a meditation practice or doing some yoga, or even if it's just taking something off your plate, like if you're overcommitted, making some decisions about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. But that, people talk about stress all the time, and it just seems like this thing, like reduce your stress. But after all these years of doing this work and taking a look at the menstrual cycle, what I find time and time again is that you see stress on the chart, and I can pick it out from a mile away. It's extremely obvious the significant impact that stress has on the cycle. So just to kind of put that out there. So another thing to keep in mind is diet. So certain choices. So I'm going to pick on a few things here, in particular, alcohol consumption, coffee consumption, and excessive sugar consumption. We all know what our vices are. If you're concerned about a short luteal phase or signs of low progesterone, and you have like 3 to 4 cups of coffee every day, or even 1 to 2, that would be something that you would want to look at. So, coffee stimulates cortisol production. So we talked about cortisol and the relationship with progesterone. So giving up coffee can have a significant impact on the menstrual cycle chart. And at the end of the day, the great thing about charting is that you can experiment, you can try things out. So you could, if you think maybe this coffee is a factor for me, whether it's not, whether alcohol is a factor for me, whether it's not, or even your sugar consumption, you can do an experiment where you take it out for one cycle and see what it looks like and then add it back. And ultimately, that's going to be the most accurate reading and most accurate display of how these things affect your body. So you don't need me to tell you. You can actually just look at your charts and see. But the key is to actually do the experiment. So actually take it out for a bit and then put it back and see how your cycles are affected by it. And so, that brings me to diet, just different things you can do, focusing on real food, staying away from processed food. So kind of like cleaning up the diet, making sure you're consuming the most nutrient dense foods, thinking about, are there any nutrients that I'm deficient in? If you recently came off of hormonal birth control, you may want to check out, I have an ebook that I actually wrote for that specific situation. So if you've actually recently come off of hormonal birth control, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook. And in that ebook, I actually go through the different steps that you'll want to take when you want to replenish those nutrients and really support your cycles to get back to normal. So it depends again on the situation, but ultimately you're going to want to focus on real food, and you're going to want to focus on foods that are nutrient dense. You're going to want to focus on healthy fats, animal fats in particular, because cholesterol is the precursor to all of our steroid hormones. So if you're concerned about low progesterone in a short luteal phase, you're going to want to give your body the raw materials that it needs to actually make these hormones. And so these hormones start with cholesterol, and you can only get cholesterol from animal foods in terms of dietary sources. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you find that, you've kind of gone through those things, you've assessed your sleep situation, sleeping in the dark now, you're managing your stress, you've given up some of the major offenders, coffee, alcohol, sugar, or at least made some modifications in that area. You're eating super clean, you're getting lots of healthy fats, but you're still not seeing the results that you're looking for. Then you're going to want to look at a few things. You're going to want to look at nutrient deficiencies. You're going to want to take a look to see if there's any foods that you might be sensitive to that could actually be indirectly causing stress. you may want to look at it, is there something going on with your thyroid, endocrine function, adrenals? Like, you want to kind of take a look at that. And that brings us to, when is it time to actually seek support? So although low progesterone is really, really common, it's not necessarily a DIY project. Depending on your specific situation, you may actually need support from somebody who can help you to figure out what is really causing it. What is the root cause? So for instance, like if you were taking hormonal birth control, but you've been off of it for long enough now that your cycle should have normalized. And so if you're still finding that this isn't going away, this issue is still there and it's still persisting, then we get to the point where it's time to actually seek support. Other things that can affect hormone production, of course, are, xenoestrogens. That's a topic I've talked about a lot. You can always take a look at what what products are you using in your house, what products do you use to clean, what products do you use on your skin. All of those types of chemicals can have an estrogenic effect and can kind of interfere with your progesterone production. So these are, again, like things that you can do just to support your body in producing progesterone. And in terms of specific nutrients to support progesterone, ensuring that you're getting enough magnesium, ensuring you're getting enough B vitamins. Vitamin C has been shown to support progesterone production. Vitamin A, so preformed retinol, is critical for hormone production. So there's a lot of key nutrients that you're going to be wanting to ensure that you're getting enough of and finding ways to incorporate them, whether it's in the diet or whether you're working with somebody and incorporating supplements to support these specific things. Either way, these are different ways that you can actually go and really work towards supporting your progesterone production. I suppose the last thing to mention is that when you do start something like this, if you've identified an issue on your chart and you've made a decision, okay, I'm going to focus on this, I'm going to make some changes, and then I'm going to take a look and see what's happening. The important thing is to give yourself some lead time. You can't expect to make a change on Tuesday and see results on Thursday. So typically you're going to want to give yourself a couple of cycles just to be able to see if it's working, see if there's any improvement. Like I mentioned, this isn't always a DIY project. So if you start making some changes, you get some information, you start experimenting with a few different things. If you don't see much of a shift within a cycle or two, you probably haven't hit the nail on the head, so to speak. And so there does come a time when you do want to reach out, and especially if you're looking to work with your body and try to find less invasive, kind of non-invasive ways of addressing it, you're wanting to focus on, diet, lifestyle, things like that. Working with functional practitioners, someone who specializes in fertility, someone who has a background in menstrual cycle charting is very helpful. But in general, someone who has a background in fertility, that is a really good thing to consider. I just want to kind of get at that myth that with progesterone, if it's low, it's just very simple for you to, take up 1 or 2 supplements and then all of a sudden it's going to be great. In terms of seeking support, there are times when it is appropriate to work with a medical doctor who has the ability to prescribe progesterone. So that's something that we've talked about on the show. So I'll link a couple of episodes in the show notes page if you're curious about progesterone supplementation and how that works. I will link a couple episodes because that is a topic that I've touched on several times on the podcast. With my background and the way that I look at the menstrual cycle, one of the challenges with progesterone supplementation is that, it doesn't necessarily address or ask the question of why is it low in the first place. But regardless, it can be extremely helpful. So for women who have had trouble conceiving or had trouble carrying, so women who've experienced multiple miscarriages, progesterone supplementation has been helpful to actually prevent that. And it's a very common practice among, many fertility specialists, fertility doctors. So that's something to consider. Again, in that type of situation, you have to work with a medical doctor so that you can get the prescription and have somebody who can do your blood work and monitor you throughout that process. But I think it's helpful to know that if you have hormone levels that are low, there is a reason why. And depending on your access, depending on your menstrual cycle chart, depending on what you're looking for, it is possible to find somebody who can actually support you in figuring out why that is and restore it. And so I think that's a good place to wrap this up today, which is that it is possible to rectify these issues once you're able to identify what the reason is, what the cause is. Once you kind of go through the list of the possible reasons why your cycles, your luteal phase may be short, your progesterone may be low, if you're having signs of these things on your chart, it is possible to figure out why. And if you're able to actually address the issue, hit the nail on the head, figure out what it is and correct that and address it, you'll see the shift in your chart. So you'll notice that your luteal phase gradually lengthens. You'll notice that the premenstrual spotting goes away. You'll notice that the temperatures follow a more typical pattern, and you'll start to see those changes. And so one of my favorite things about charting and about teaching women to chart their cycles and to really learn body literacy is that you can continue to use your charts as it's like a barometer. So, each chart gives you information and you can compare your previous charts to see if you're actually going in the right direction, if you're moving in the right direction, and if what you're doing is working. So I want to thank you for listening to today's episode. You'll find the show notes page and all of the links that I was referring to in this episode over at fertilityfriday.com/185. Now, I'd love to continue the conversation with you. If you think that your progesterone is low, if you have experienced a short luteal phase, or if you're experiencing that right now, if you're experiencing spotting before your period, or if this is something that's been ongoing for you that you've kind of been struggling with for a little while, I want to invite you to chat with us in our Facebook community. So I'm going to post a thread when I release this episode in the Facebook community, which you'll find over at fertilityfriday.com/community. And I want to hear from you. Have you experienced this? What have you tried to improve your progesterone production? Just to kind of share some of those experiences. Like I mentioned, it's really, really common, and it's especially common in certain situations, at certain phases. And so that's something I think we just need to draw more attention to. And yeah, in some cases, it's super concerning, especially if it's persisting. And in other cases, it may be expected. Like if you came off of hormonal birth control and it's been like 3 weeks or it's been maybe 2 months, then it wouldn't be cause for concern yet, because we're still within that time frame, that short time frame. So I think it's helpful to have these conversations and to really kind of dig into what to do about it. So make sure to join me in the Facebook community and we can chat about it more. So fertilityfriday.com/community. As I mentioned, if you've recently come off of hormonal birth control, make sure to check out my free ebook, fertilityfriday.com/ebook. And if you're looking for specialized support, if you are tired of trying to figure all this stuff out on your own and you really wanting someone to walk you through and to help you with this whole charting thing, both the fertility awareness aspect, but also the interpretation aspect, to have that kind of my brain on your chart, looking at your specific situation and really helping you to kind of sort everything out and put all the pieces together, make sure to check out the different programs that I offer. So you'll find those at fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. So I just want to thank you again for listening to the show, for supporting the show. At the time of this recording, we've actually just hit the 1 million download mark. I'm so excited. I can barely believe it. It is incredible. I am so thankful for all of my amazing listeners. The Fertility Friday community is the absolute best. When I started podcasting, a little over 3 years ago, I don't even think I ever considered that this could happen. Like it never even occurred to me. I remember very vividly when I hit 10,000 downloads several months in, and I remember thinking it was just so surreal. Like that number was so big, and I couldn't believe that someone had listened to the show that many times. And now fast forward, 3 years later, and we've just hit the 1 million download mark. So of course that doesn't mean necessarily that 1 million people have listened to the show, but it means that all this incredible community has listened to various episodes 1 million times. And so that is just wild. So I will be trying to wrap my head around that. And in the meantime, I just want to thank you again for being part of this community. and also for sharing the show with your friends, for continuing to spread the word about fertility awareness, and for really being part of this movement so that more women can gain body literacy and really gain that knowledge that we all deserve to have about our menstrual cycles. So thank you so much. And as always, be well and happy charting.